It was the 20th of February 1943, north of Kasserine Pass, and the world, as the German Tank Corps understood it was about to collapse. Through the haze of burning diesel and the ochre dust of Tunisia, 5 Sherman tanks appeared like ghosts in motion, their movements impossibly synchronized. They emerged and vanished behind broken ridgelines, each turn of their turrets and burst of fire forming part of a pattern no doctrine could explain. No flares, no signal flags, no runners between machines. Yet they moved as if they shared one mind. From my position in a Panzer IV, I remember gripping the intercom switch, hearing only static that cursed hiss that filled every German headset when the fighting grew near. My commander shouted into the receiver, his voice devoured by noise. "Souhaitez compagnie, linky flanky." But nothing came back. The line dissolved into the growl of our Maybach engine and the crackling roar of the desert wind. The Americans, somehow, were talking clearly through the chaos. We could see it in how they maneuvered one tank covering another's blind spot, turrets pivoting in perfect relay. We thought they had found a new form of discipline or a miracle of training. We didn't yet know it was something else, something invisible. The official reports later said those Shermans operated with unusual coordination and non-visual control. What they didn't record was how it felt to watch it the moment when men realized the enemy could see through dust and confusion in ways we could not. I remember a Feldwebel beside me whispering, "Sie kämpfen mit Gedanken, they fight with thoughts." It wasn't poetry, it was fear. Our Panzer radios, the Fug 5 sets, were still considered advanced in the 1930 seconds. 10-watt transmitters, amplitude modulation, fragile tuning capacitors, but in the sandstorm of Kasserine, they may as well have been tin cans on a string. Their range fell from kilometers to a few hundred meters, if that. Each spark plug in the tank engine spat interference straight into our headsets. And worst of all, most of our tanks couldn't even reply. The platoon leader alone could transmit. The rest could only listen, and when that lead tank went up in smoke, so did our communication. Entire formations fought blind. The Shermans, by contrast, spoke to one another like organs of the same body. Every tank commander could transmit, every gunner could hear, and every movement was shaped by a shared voice carried on clear, unbroken waves. They were not guessing, they were listening, and their confidence showed in the rhythm of their attacks, relentless, cohesive, terrifyingly precise. None of us knew then that those invisible threads of sound, those unseen bonds, were born thousands of miles away in a laboratory in Chicago. That somewhere, long before we ever reached Tunisia, a group of American engineers had bent the invisible spectrum to their will. They had built something called the SCR-508, a 25-watt, frequency-modulated radio that could cut through the noise of war like sunlight through smoke. But that morning at Kasserine, all we understood was this. No matter how thick our armor or how skilled our gunners, we were fighting an enemy who was already inside the future. The secret that turned the tide of that battle wasn't forged in steel or oil, but in silence, in the hum of a laboratory where men worked through the night, chasing clarity through chaos. July 22, 1941, while German panzers tore eastward across the Soviet plains, another kind of war was being prepared inside the walls of the Galvin Manufacturing Company in Chicago. The men there were not soldiers, but their invention would win more battles than any single gun. Daniel E. Noble, a quiet man with a habit of scribbling circuit sketches on scraps of paper, believed that war could be won not only by bullets, but by frequency. Beside him, Henryk Magnuski, the Polish-born RF engineer who had seen his own homeland fall to the German Blitz, was determined to make sure America's soldiers would never fight blind. Together, they worked beneath the flicker of fluorescent lamps, the air sharp with the smell of solder and ozone. They didn't yet know that what they were building, the SCR-508, would become the invisible backbone of American armored warfare. Noble had first conceived the idea of using frequency modulation, FM, in military vehicles, a technology pioneered by Edwin Armstrong but never before trusted in combat. It was radical. Everyone relied on amplitude modulation, AM, the same system that carried peacetime radio broadcasts. But AM was fragile. Every spark plug, every electric motor bled noise into the signal. Static swallowed words. Orders became guesses. FM changed that. By varying the frequency rather than the amplitude, it could filter out the chaos. It didn't just carry a voice, it preserved its clarity through thunder and fire. Magnuski's challenge was far more brutal. Could such delicate circuitry survive inside a tank? A Sherman's interior was a violent world heat, vibration, metal-on-metal shock, the roar of a 400-horsepower engine. He once wrote that getting a radio to speak clearly inside that chaos was like asking a bird to sing in a hurricane. So he built everything twice. Every crystal oscillator, every resistor, every wire had to survive dust, oil, and artillery concussions. By autumn of 1941, they had a working prototype, the SCR-508, weighing 181 pounds, an unassuming box of brushed metal and promise. Inside was the BC-604 transmitter, a 25-watt powerhouse that outshined the German Fug 5's feeble 10-watt design. It operated between 20 and 27.9 MHz, offering 10 preset channels controlled by quartz crystals. No more drifting off frequency. No more retuning mid-battle. A commander could switch channels with a twist of a dial and trust that every tank around him heard the same words at the same instant. The Americans didn't just build one radio, they built a network. Each tank carried dual receivers, the BC-603 seconds, allowing commanders to monitor their platoon net while keeping a constant ear on company command. Orders flowed like blood through arteries upward, downward, sideways, and no tank was ever mute. For the first time in history, an armored force could move as one living organism. The contrast to the German Fug 5 system was night and day. Their amplitude-modulated sets, though brilliant for their time, were locked into the limitations of their era. Hand-tuned variable capacitors that slipped with vibration, fragile tubes that cracked under heat, signals lost in the pulse of their own engines. In the deserts of North Africa, where temperature and distance conspired against them, the Fug 5 was already an echo of the past. When Motorola's engineers watched footage of tank tests at Fort Knox, they saw their creation come alive. Noble later said it was like watching a thought pass from one machine to another. The Shermans wheeled in perfect arcs, every movement mirrored, every order obeyed without delay. The invisible lines between them were clearer than the horizon. Detroit's assembly line soon roared to life. Between 1,942 and 1,944, more than 50,000 SCR-508 sets rolled out, enough for every Sherman tank ever built. Each one a heart beating inside steel, transmitting courage, confusion, laughter, and death in equal measure. Each one part of something vast, something unseen, a web of voices that would stretch across continents. And somewhere in Chicago, as production scaled beyond anything the engineers had imagined, Daniel Noble received a note from a Signal Corps officer who had just returned from field trials in Louisiana. It was short, almost casual, but it changed everything. He wrote, "Your radio makes the tanks talk, and when they talk, they win." No one in that lab could have known it yet, but the world had just crossed a threshold. War would never again belong to the loudest gun. It would belong to the clearest voice. When the first American tanks landed in North Africa in November 1942, most of us still believed that war was measured by armor thickness and gun caliber. The Sherman was mocked by German crews too tall, too thin, too soft. Yet, within weeks, the Afrika Korps began whispering about something far stranger than any weapon upgrade. They said the Americans could see through dust. that they always moved as if they knew what their comrades were doing over the next ridge. It began during Operation Torch near Safi and Faidala. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division came ashore with their new SCR-508 radios gleaming behind steel. In the first engagements, they faced Panzer divisions that had survived everything from Tobruk to El Alamein. But this time, something was different. The American tanks, many commanded by officers who had never met, moved as though they shared the same pulse. A German intercept officer in the 10th Panzer Division later wrote in his logbook, "Their voices carry too clearly. Even under fire, they answer instantly. Either they train beyond reason, or their devices are not of this world." He wasn't wrong about the devices. Our own Fug 5 radios could barely carry a voice half a kilometer once the engines started. Each spark plug firing was a thunderclap in the headset. Every time we moved, the static grew until it swallowed words whole. The sand was filled with men shouting into silence. When command tanks were hit, and they were easy to find by their antennae, the platoon froze. Orders vanished into smoke. The Americans never froze. I remember one engagement near Kasserine Pass. A Sherman formation split by a ravine reorganized itself mid-battle, each tank adjusting to the others as if following invisible choreography. Later, we learned that every Sherman commander was hearing not just his superior's voice, but the chatter of the entire platoon network. Positions, targets, warnings, all in real time. In the confusion of that desert war, they spoke to each other across 50 miles of scattered battlefield. They called for artillery, guided reinforcements, warned others of ambushes, all while we fought alone, tank by tank. When our intercept units tuned into their frequency, the clarity was shocking. Voices, clean and steady, as if transmitted from a quiet room instead of a battlefield. We could understand every word but never replicate it. Our commanders wrote it off as discipline. The Americans are well drilled, that is all. They never suspected the true cause, that frequency modulation had erased the chaos that crippled us. As the Battle of Kasserine Pass reached its peak in February 1943, that invisible advantage turned the tide. Though the Germans claimed a tactical victory, it was hollow. The Americans learned faster than we did. They adapted through their network of voices. By nightfall, while we struggled to regroup, their scattered units were already reforming by radio command, calling for air support, even coordinating with artillery batteries miles away. To stand against that kind of coordination was to feel the future closing in. I remember staring at my ruined radio set, smoke curling from the casing, the static fading into a faint hum. Somewhere in that hum, I imagined I could still hear them, the American voices threading the desert like electric ghosts. Later, captured intelligence reports from our side noted it coldly. Enemy tank formations maintained communication, where ours produce only static. But no report could describe what that meant to the men inside the machines. To be cut off was to feel small, to fight alone in a war too vast to understand. They had connection. We had silence. And in war, silence is death. By the time we reached Italy in the autumn of 1943, even the mountains had learned to hide from sound. Valleys twisted and folded radio waves into nonsense. In theory, this should have crippled the Americans, whose tank coordination had stunned us in the open desert. Yet somehow, the same coordination persisted stronger, if anything. In the Apennines, Sherman platoons that couldn't see one another through the fog of rain and stone still moved as one. I remember reading after the war how our signals officers were baffled by this. Impossible, they wrote. The terrain destroys amplitude modulation, and they were right, ours, not theirs. The SCR-508 thrived in the places where our radios failed. Its frequency-modulated signal bounced through ravines and ridges, bending instead of breaking. While our Fug 5 units choked on echoes, the American FM sets hummed clear and alive. Reports described how entire formations advanced through mountain passes without ever relying on visual signals. To us, it looked like sorcery. But even sorcery has limits. When the Shermans rolled onto the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, their radios sang to one another, and to the ships offshore a triumph of invisible coordination. Yet another problem revealed itself. The tanks could not speak to their own infantry. The frequencies didn't match. The tank's 27.9 MHz against the foot soldiers' SCR 300 at 48 MHz. It's strange, reading the after-action notes, now the same notes that used to pass across intelligence desks like whispers from another world. They speak of confusion in the hedgerows, where German soldiers armed with Panzerfausts crept within 50 meters of American tanks, while the infantry screamed warnings no one could hear. The radio nets were alive, but disconnected from the men they were meant to protect. Then came a small miracle, not from an engineer's lab this time, but from the field. Somewhere in Normandy, a young signal sergeant took an EE-8 field telephone, bolted it into a spare ammunition box, and wired it straight into the tank's internal intercom. Infantry could lift the handset, press their face against the steel, and speak directly to the men inside. The first field test saved 2 platoons from ambush. Within weeks, every Sherman carried one. By Operation Cobra that July, those improvised phones had changed everything. Tankers could finally listen to the infantry that walked beside them, the eyes and ears they'd been missing. The battlefield became conversational again. Voices crossed between armor and flesh, between iron tracks and muddy boots. I often think about that detail, the voice pressed against the hull, shouting through the din of battle, and how it captured something larger about the war. Technology gave them clarity, yes, but humanity gave them connection. When you can hear someone's breath over the line, you fight differently. The Americans learned that faster than anyone. They learned to adapt their machines to the lives inside them, not the other way around. Every fix, every patch, every rewired box carried that same principle: communication above all. By the time Cobra thundered through Normandy's hedgerows in late July 1944, those radios, those voices, moved as one heartbeat. Over 200 Sherman tanks advanced under the direction of a single voice, each crew responding instantly to commands that seemed to arrive before the words were finished. The Germans facing them, men from Panzer Lehr Division, never stood a chance. They were superior in steel, inferior in sound. That was the moment the war began to tilt irreversibly. We had the heavier armor, the longer guns, the experience of years, but they had unity. And unity, I learned, was louder than any cannon. By the fall of 1944, the battlefield had changed its voice. What once sounded like chaos now pulsed with rhythm, an invisible network humming across Europe. From the hedgerows of France to the steel bridges over the Rhine, American armor fought not as individual tanks, but as a single, connected organism. Every transmission carried intent. Every reply carried life. The contrast was clearest in the Battle of Aricourt, September 1944. There, in the Lorraine fog, the U.S. 4th Armored Division faced German Panther Brigade's machines that outgunned and out-armored them in every measurable way. On paper, it should have been a massacre. Yet, it wasn't. I've read the after-action reports. The numbers don't lie. 281 German armored vehicles destroyed, for only 41 Shermans lost, 7-1. How? Because the Americans fought as if they all shared the same set of eyes. Each Sherman could report enemy movement instantly. Tank destroyers fired based on coordinates whispered over the radio by men they couldn't even see. Forward observers in Sherman command tanks called down artillery within minutes. While our Panzers struggled to raise even their nearest comrades, the Americans were weaving death through the air. For the first time, I began to understand what information itself could do. Every intercepted message told the same story: fluid commands, seamless reactions, precision that no single commander could orchestrate alone. They weren't faster because they were braver. They were faster because they were connected. Meanwhile, our own world was shrinking. Germany's factories, already starved of copper and components, could no longer equip every tank with radios. By 1943, we'd produced nearly 5,700 medium tanks, but barely 2,000 functional transceivers. Some units cannibalized parts from wrecks just to stay in contact for one more engagement. In desperation, field crews tried running power straight from the tank's dynamo, only to drown in static. You could hear the spark plug singing louder than the orders. Even General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, knew it was over. His 1937 book, Achtung Panzer, had preached that communication was the soul of armored warfare, yet by late 1944, his own army could not follow his creed. In a memorandum that December, he admitted, "Our tanks fight as individuals, the enemy as a single machine." Then came Remagen, March 1945. The Americans found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing over the Rhine, a miracle of steel no German demolition team had managed to destroy in time. Within minutes, word traveled by radio through the 9th Armored Division, then to 1st Army headquarters, then across the entire Western Front. Within an hour, divisions were already on the move to seize the crossing. That speed communication turning opportunity into momentum was something we could only dream of. Our telephone lines had been bombed to fragments. Couriers took hours to reach commanders who no longer commanded anything coherent. When Field Marshal Walter Model tried to organize a counterattack, his last transmitted message was bleak. No contact with adjacent units. No communication with higher headquarters. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. Impossible. That word haunted every German officer who still believed in precision and control. As our armies disintegrated, theirs fused tighter. The SCR-508 had become more than a machine. It was the nervous system of an empire in motion. Tank platoons from different battalions merged their nets, artillery synced to armor, and infantry phones tied it all together. Each Sherman that rolled forward carried not just men and ammunition, but connection. I imagine now the American commanders watching maps light up with reports, orders flowing like current through copper veins. Theirs was not a war of guessing anymore. It was orchestration conducted in real time. For us, silence had become our only companion. Even victory, when it came, felt disconnected, a single tank's triumph in a vacuum. But for them, every victory was shared instantly, spoken aloud across the ether. That was the difference. That was the future being born. By April 1945, the war was already whispering its ending. The forests of Germany were full of smoke and broken armor, and the air itself seemed to buzz with the voices of the Americans. Their radios never stopped reports, requests, laughter, prayers, all layered into one relentless current. For them, even in the wreckage, there was always a voice answering back. For us, there was only the silence of defeat. The Ruhr Pocket was where I saw it most clearly. 300,000 German troops, cut off by armored columns that spoke to one another with surgical precision. I read later how the 1st and 9th U.S. armies executed a double envelopment entirely by radio, not by maps or pre-written plans, but through words transmitted in real time. Their coordination was so fluid that even the sky obeyed. American fighter bombers, guided by forward air controllers with tank-mounted radios, struck exactly where needed. Inside the pocket, our own communication system collapsed. Cables were gone, radios jammed or shorted. Entire divisions fought without knowing who still existed beside them. I remember the final message of Field Marshal Walter Model, transmitted before his line went dead. No contact with adjacent units. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible. That was the sound of an army dying not under fire, but from silence. After the surrender, American intelligence teams combed through what remained of our machines. They studied our Fugue 5 and shook their heads. Their report was cold and merciless. German tank communications, approximately 5 years behind American systems. Soviet evaluators agreed, and when the Red Army began rebuilding after the war, and they didn't copy our radios, they copied the Americans. The statistics that followed were as brutal as any casualty list. American production, over 50,000 SCR, 508 family radios for 49,324 Sherman tanks. Transmission power, 25 watts, crystal controlled to plus or minus 0.01%. Effective range, 10-15 miles stationary, 7 miles on the move. German production, around 6,000 Fugue 5 transceivers for 12,000 medium and heavy tanks. Transmission power, 10 watts, unstable, range less than 2 miles when moving. Full communication capability, 20% of tanks. 20% of us could speak. All of them could. In those numbers lies the true measure of defeat, not in armor, nor in courage, but in communication. The Americans didn't just build tanks, they built a network. Each Sherman was a node in a living web of information that outpaced anything in existence. Their engineers had understood what we never did, that war was no longer about who could hit harder, but who could understand faster. After the war, even the new German army, the Bundeswehr, learned that lesson. Every Leopard tank built after 1955 carried advanced FM systems. One of their manuals contained a line I can still recite by heart. The defeat of superior German tanks by inferior American vehicles with superior radios teaches that information dominance outweighs platform superiority. And history, it seems, keeps proving them right. In the Gulf War of 1991, American and coalition tanks, speaking through digital descendants of the SCR-508, destroyed Iraqi forces equipped with more powerful Soviet-designed armor. The same story repeated in 2003, when speed of communication again crushed strength of firepower. That is the legacy of those invisible waves born in a Chicago laboratory in 1941. The moment the first SCR-508 came alive, war itself shifted. The Sherman stopped being a single machine. It became part of something collective, something conscious. I sometimes think about what it must have felt like to be one of those American tankers in 1945 engines, rumbling, dust swirling, yet never alone. Somewhere always another voice crackling through the headset. We're with you. Keep moving. That's what we never had. That's what we never understood until it was gone. In the end, no shell or armor plate decided the outcome. It was the sound between them, that clear, unwavering signal that turned noise into order and men into a unified force. The Americans won their war not just with steel, but with connection, and the rest of us, blind in our isolation, learned too late that in modern combat, connection equals survival, and silence equals defeat.